Welcome to Reality Check. It seems that energy is back in the news. We've got the Waxman-Markey bill going. We have a ever-rising price of oil, and the media is complaining that it shouldn't be this high. I'm Richard Loomis, president of World Energy and CEO of World Energy Television.
And I'm Jim Poplava, president of PFS Group, down here at the San Diego Daily Transcript.
Well, it seems once again that the price of oil has swung back up from a low in the 30s, now scratching 70. Jim, what do you think the cause is?
Well, you know, Richard, if we take a look at where oil prices went last year, and this has been one heck of a roller coaster ride. We've seen oil prices last year go from $100 a barrel to $147, and just as quickly go from $147 all the way down to $32 a barrel. To begin with, prices never really belonged at $32 a barrel because the market price for oil was much less than the cost of production. So it's not surprising that it would bounce back once the wave of deleveraging that was taking place with hedge funds, pension funds that were divesting themselves of their oil holdings. I think that was really behind the precipitous drop that we saw last year. It had a lot more to do with deleveraging.
Well, I think it's interesting, Jim, when we look at this, because you've got some financial groups that are predicting $85 oil by the end of the year, and then others saying that there is a glut of supply, the demand is off, and the price should be coming back down again. And then you have the media saying it's those pesky speculators. They're driving the price, and they need to be penalized.
You know, Richard, there's one thing that I'd like to talk about here. Let's begin with that, because we're taking a look at, I have a copy here of the IEA estimates, and originally they were estimating for 2009 about 85 million barrels a day of consumption globally. They've revised that down, and now they're talking about 83 million barrels a day of global consumption in the world. What I find is rather remarkable about all of this is it took the largest global recession that we've seen probably in the last half century to bring global oil demand down by 2 million barrels.
Yeah, I think also if we look back last year when the price hit $147, I think our daily global demand was 87 million barrels. So at a very, very peak, we were 5 million barrels from where we are today. When they said that our daily use would be 85 million, that was a reduction by 2. Now we're at 83, that's a reduction by 4. But again, if I'm drawing a curve, as economists like to do, that's almost minimal change. It doesn't reflect 100% reduction in the price.
Now, and I think what's very important, I want to put up a couple graphs here, Richard, and this is from the Department of Energy, and it takes a look at oil demand in the United States. There's been a trend here in the Western world, not only in the United States, but also in Europe, Japan, where you have, when you think about the pricing of oil and demand for it, you got to really think about two kinds of consumers. And the first kind of consumer is the Western consumer who is subject to world market prices. The price of oil goes up, gasoline prices go up the pump, people buy more fuel-efficient cars, they travel less. And if we look at this first graph here, which is vehicle miles traveled in the U.S., you can see here it peaked in January of 2004. So as the price of oil moved from $30, $40 a barrel to $70 a barrel to $100 a barrel and eventually $147, you can see the corresponding drop, at least here in the United States, in the vehicle miles traveled in the U.S. So Western consumers, and especially those in the United States, were responding to higher oil prices and consuming less by driving less. If we take
70% of our oil imports are in transportation. So if you look at, or 70% of our consumption is transportation. And our gasoline price has been up and down as well. And currently, I think here in at least in Houston, our cheap stuff is back up to $2.50, which matches with a $70 price of oil.
Yeah, we're already in California. We're over $3. $3.23 on the way in this morning for super. So we're already over $3. And if prices go up, which I think they're going to go up next year, especially as economies eventually improve. And that's really the more significant thing. But I think what we need to do here is sort of address the issue of demand and talk about, okay, you've got 6.5 billion people on the planet today. There's a little over 1 billion people that live in the Western world, the United States, Canada, Europe, Japan, that are industrialized countries that operate under market principles. On the other hand, you have non-developed countries in the world, the emerging markets, China, Brazil, Latin American countries that are not subject to market prices. So, Richard, for the vast majority of people that live on this planet, they are not subject to the same market prices. If I'm living in Iran or I'm living in Venezuela, I don't know that world prices are $70 a barrel or they were $147 a barrel like we saw last year, because their governments subsidize the price. And it's
there's something else that we need to look there as well. If you look at Venezuela, domestically they're using about 800,000 barrels a day. I think they're exporting 2 million barrels a day, somewhere in there. If we look at China, China is using about 7.5 billion, maybe a little more, a day. And you look at India, and they're using roughly 2.7 billion. If you look at the United States, even with this reduction that we've seen, I think we're still at 19 million barrels a day. I mean, it's a lot of oil.
Well, here's something interesting, because, we've seen the stories in the news. The bankruptcy of GM, the bankruptcy of Chrysler, auto sales down to levels that we haven't seen in 2 or 3 decades. And, when on the surface you look at that and you say, okay, the demand is down in the United States, and everything focuses around, U.S. inventories, U.S. demand. But I'd like to pull up, let's go to that table on China's domestic imports of crude oil, because if we take a look at China's, and these figures are of April this year, they're actually gone up since May. But if we take a look at net crude imports in China, they're up 13% year over year. If we look at total net imports, 7.8%. And apparent demand in China is up nearly 6%. And I'd like to follow with another chart that I think is rather significant, and that is of Chinese auto sales up, which are up 34% year over year as of April this year. And I think by May, they had a record month in May. There are actually inventory bottlenecks for the automobile dealers in China, where people are actually signing up in line, putting in bids or ordering cars where they're having to wait to take delivery.
So, well, what's fun about that, Jim, is the auto market in China will actually exceed the sales this year in the United States. They're on target to sell 11 million cars.
But when we talk about demand for energy, I think you really have to separate this between, let's say, the 1 and 1.5 billion people that live in the developed world, subject to market forces, who are reacting to higher prices by economizing, trading in maybe the gas hog and getting more fuel-efficient car, traveling less. And you have to compare that with the developed world, or the developing world, where 5.5 billion people live, who live in conditions where the price of energy is subsidized. And that's one of the reasons why throughout this decade we saw these incredible growth rates in the demand for energy that was coming from a world that was not only industrializing, which means they were using a lot more power because of putting in factories, and that's where a lot of manufacturing is taking place. But in addition to that, they were acquiring a middle-class lifestyle, and one of the luxuries of a middle-class lifestyle is owning an automobile. And so once somebody goes from a bicycle to a motor scooter to an automobile, they have now become an energy consumer. And that was something that didn't exist, let's say, 10 years or 20 years ago. If we looked at the developed world, everything centered around the markets such as Europe and the United States as the drivers of energy demand. Now we've got another 5 billion plus people on the other side of the planet who are now becoming a major factor when it comes to energy consumption.
Well, and look at the growth rates. in the United States, we have about 240 million, 241 million cars. In China, we got 27 million. So it is a much smaller market. So it has a lot of room to grow. The other bright spot in China is the motorcycle market. Because as people grow up that chain that you just described, more of them are picking it up. In India, they've got 1.5 million in auto sales. They have a market now with about 12 million cars in it. But again, now they have a used car market in India, and they're selling 1 million of those a year. And those are mainly your entry-level guys, and your people who own cars are upgrading or adding cars to their fleet. And let's not forget those cars that China is buying. They just made a deal to buy Hummer from GM. So I don't think they're going to get smaller on the car. I think they're going to get bigger.
You know, and there's in addition to the developing world, Richard, I think there's another important factor. Close to half of the world's oil comes from OPEC or OPEC-related countries that produce a lot of the world's oil and own a lot of the world's largest oil fields. If you take a look at, for example, when you think of electricity in the United States, you might think of a coal-fired plant, you might think of growing alternative energy, nuclear-powered plants. In the Middle East, countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and others use oil to power much of their electricity. And if you look at a trend that's taking place within OPEC itself, I don't care if you're looking at many of the Gulf states or even Saudi Arabia, they are industrializing. Saudi Arabia is building 2 new cities where they're building petrochemical complexes because they figured out, just like the integrated oil companies, we can sell oil to the rest of the world, or we can take the product that we produce, develop it in our own refineries, and make 5 times as much money.
Well, and I think it's interesting what we're doing about energy consumption. Let's look at what this cash for guzzlers that Obama just put into the defense bill. Basically, now that we are owners, I guess, as a federal government of GM, we're going to get into stimulating the car market. So if you look at that, and if you can trade your car in, your 10-year-old car, and get yourself a brand new one and a $3,500 credit from the federal government, I would imagine that if you go through all that effort and you buy the car, you're going to use it. And if you're going to use it, I think we're going to see the same effect that we had in the 70s, that as cars get better mileage, we drive more. And as we drive more, our consumption should come back up.
You know, this relates to, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers have heard this, that the U.S. is more energy efficient today. We consume less energy per dollar of GDP. That's correct. But take a look at all the technology that we were able to invent in the automobile industry, for example. We were able to take that technology to build bigger cars that could drive at, lesser miles of consumption per gallon of gasoline. So even though we advanced our energy technology, what we ended up doing is using more of it. I mean, if you take a look at, for example, the average consumer today in a house, you've got big screen TVs, you have computers, not just one computer, several computers. You have several televisions. So a lot of these devices that we've come up with technology just means we're consuming more energy. Yes, per dollar of GDP we're consuming less, but overall, if you take a look at the last 2 decades, energy consumption has grown in the United States, which brings up a question that perhaps you can address, is if we are going to go to alternatives, if we are going to go to, let's say, more fuel-efficient means of transportation, and whether it's hybrids, whether it's electric cars, or electrifying the transportation system, that still implies, Richard, that we're going to have to build power plants and we're going to have to get power somewhere.
It certainly does. And if we look at this and kind of where we're sitting, if you start to get more access, like the Tata coming to the United States by the end of the year, and these cars having these discounts and we start putting in more, if we start looking at alternatives, which Jim Mulva was correct, at this point, true alternatives, which would be wind and solar, if you exclude hydro, are still less than 1% of our power supply. And they don't run cars on electricity. Even the hybrid has to have gasoline. So you really run into a problem here if you're going to keep demand going up. if the economy recovers, and even if it doesn't, U.S. demand is at 100 quadrillion BTUs annually. That's including transportation. That is a big, big bucket that needs to be filled every year. So if we look at what we're doing now, and we say, okay, what's our most fuel-efficient source for energy? 50% of our power comes from coal. 97% of our transportation comes from oil. We've got 20% in natural gas, and we've got about 18% in nuclear. And the rest is made up between hydro, solar, and wind. I think what we're going to see happen if the cap and trade bill passes is coal's going to get very expensive. You're going to see at least a 70, 80 cent increase per gallon because of cap and trade on gasoline. And what we're missing is where are we going to make up the BTUs? Because if you encourage wind power and you encourage nuclear power, those take time to develop. And we don't have that kind of time. And I don't see a lot of discussion about natural gas. Natural gas would be an obvious alternative for the United States. We have a lot of it, and we have a lot of capacity to generate from it. We simply aren't using it today. So can the U.S. adapt to a higher energy price? I think it probably can. Is the consumer going to like it? No. Is the industry as a whole going to be okay in this environment? Can we provide enough energy for this economy? We can if you take the handcuffs off, and it'll remain to see whether or not we do that.
That's the interesting thing, because in the last energy crisis that we saw in the 70s, you saw European countries, number one, they adopted policies that encouraged, let's say, fuel-efficient cars. The cars driven in Europe are much more fuel-efficient. They're smaller. They also developed a high-speed rail system, so mass transit is much more available than what you have in the United States. And then they also developed nuclear power. So the question is, as the price of energy goes up, are we adopting policies, number one, that encourage the use of or the production of cheap energy? And number two, are we giving consumers an alternative? Are we building high-speed rail systems, light rail systems for transportation? If we're electrifying or plan on electrifying the fuel fleet, whether it's electric trains, electric cars, then what are we doing to provide additional electricity? Because we know, for example, if we're not going to go the route with coal, which is where we have plenty of resources, you have Secretary of Energy Chu is talking about adding more nuclear power plants. But once again, Richard, that takes 7 to 10 years. So, and then by the same token, even though we're still consuming, like you talk about, a hybrid car may use its battery, but it still consumes gasoline. We're adopting policies or tax policies that would harm much of the country's independent producers. So it seems to me there's a lot of cross currents here. They're at odds with each other in terms of producing a well-orchestrated and well-thought-out energy plan.
That's very true. And I mean, if I were Secretary Chu and I was looking for low-hanging fruit, a way to reduce CO2 and a way to increase our power supply, I would be heavily focused on natural gas. Now, if you look at natural gas in the United States, we have a lot of it. However, a lot of the independent producers are pulling back. And they have to, because the price of natural gas is still under $4. So while we have a $70 oil price and we desperately need the supply, natural gas is down to $4 and we're laying down the rigs.
Well, and also, Richard, too, I think it applies equally as well to alternatives. Many of the alternatives that are out there, whether it's offshore wind power, wind turbines on land, or even solar, a lot of that is very expensive. So it takes higher energy prices to make alternatives a viable option in terms of replacing fossil fuels. So, you know, whether we like it or not, I think the marketplace is going to force higher prices. And those higher prices eventually force some kind of conservation in the United States, whether it's, once again, as we put up that first graph, whether it's fewer miles traveled by Americans, whether it's trading the clunker in for at least one fuel-efficient car for the family. But I think one of the alternatives that you're going to see is a different type of lifestyle, which will address later on in this series.
Well, just before we wrap this up, I want to come back to natural gas for a moment, because over the last 15 years, most of the new power builds, power generation, have been natural gas. And it's unfortunate, but only 25% of that capacity is currently being used. Most of our power generation, our baseload generation, is coal, because coal has to be run 24/7. Whereas a natural gas plant, you can bring it up when you need it, which is why it's used for peaker generation. With these low prices on natural gas, again, if I'm going to come up with a policy that reduces CO2 and increases the overall power supply for the United States, I would be trying to pass some laws that would allow the utilities to use this spare capacity and start bringing those generators online. It's already in place. We've already built it. The infrastructure's there. The fuel supply is there, and it's cheap. However, every time I hear Secretary Chu or I see our President Obama talking about the energy policy, it's all about renewables. It's not about what's achievable today to maintain low-priced energy for our economy. That is industrial oxygen, and we need it.
Well, and also, too, if you look at just the stark reality, as the head of ConocoPhillips was talking about, you take a look at what we use in our transportation fleet, what we use to power this country. It's great to talk about alternatives, but they represent such a small fraction, 1, 2, 3% of our total consumption of energy. And it's very unrealistic to assume that that 3% segment of the energy market is going to replace the other 97% of the market in the next 10 years. It's just unrealistic.
I mean, there are very, very few countries, with the exception of Denmark, that generate significant amounts of their energy through renewable sources. So as a planet, if we're going to move forward, if we're going to figure this equation out and power the planet without killing it off, we've got to get serious about how you generate BTUs. And today's renewable sources don't generate large quantities of BTUs. That doesn't mean we can't be focused on them. We need to be. But if I read the crisis right, and I look at what's in the news, and I hear what's happening around the world, I think we better get very, very serious on how we're going to generate the demand that we need, that will bring the prices up, that will get things in alignment so that we can provide the energy that will allow us to grow and remain as the leading economy on the planet. If the Chinese figure it out before we do, they're going to be the leading economy on the planet.
Well, it seems like they are figuring it out, because if you take a look at what the Chinese have been doing since the beginning of the year, Richard, they're acquiring natural resources, energy, iron ore, and they're scouring the planet trying to find these resources, lock in, whether it's investing in Russia, where they just locked up 300,000 barrels a day, whether it's investing in Brazil, where they're going to finance Petrobras's major finds off the Pacific, or it's investing in Africa. So the Chinese get it, because they know.
Well, they just invested in Iraq as well.
Yeah, so I mean, they know that in order to power this economy of theirs and industrialize, it's going to take raw materials and it's going to take energy. So I think the Chinese get it. They have a plan. They're forward thinking. I just hope it's not too late for us here in the U.S. before we wake up. The one thing I think that will bring the wake-up call, though, is what we've seen since transpired since February, where we've seen the price of oil go from over $30 a barrel to today's price closer to $70 a barrel. And already, analysts from at Raymond James and Goldman Sachs are talking about $85 oil. I'm sure next year we'll be talking about $100 oil. So I think it's going to be the marketplace and rising prices, unfortunately, that's going to have to wake us up again.
Well, I think that brings us back to where we started this conversation. We're sitting at $70 oil today. We had dropped all the way down to the high 30s. And once again, we're talking about how demand is off. So why are these prices so high? I think what we've talked about over the last few minutes really shows that demand is not off far enough to ever get us back down to $30. And as demand goes back and increases globally, this only gets worse.
Well, Richard, I think this is a good point to stop. And in the next segment, we're going to talk about why prices are where they are. We've talked about demand in this segment. The next segment, we're going to talk about the supply side. Where is it going to come from? I'm Jim Poplava.
And I'm Richard Loomis, and thank you very much for watching.